In the 14th season of the show Grey's Anatomy, there's an episode where Dr. April Kepner is directing a contest for the surgeons at Seattle Grace. All the other surgeons are excited to compete with one another and eagerly awaiting April to post the rules to the competition. Unfortunately, April's life is in a freefall, reeling from the trauma of losing a marriage and two close friends. Her life seems to be falling apart around her, and so when her boyfriend asks, "Hey, April, aren't you supposed to post the rules to the contest this morning?" she responds, "God is asleep at the wheel and humanity is locked in the trunk. They can wait for the damn rules." God is asleep at the wheel and humanity is locked in the trunk. What an image. It sure does feel that way during this pandemic. Like we're bouncing around in the back of a trunk with no one at the wheel in a car that is careening off the road, with our bodies being bruised against the frame and our minds filled with anxiety because it feels like there's nothing that we can do but wait for the vehicle to either run out of gas or crash into something big enough to stop our trajectory. The hits keep on coming one after another, and we feel powerless and hopeless and trapped. Then it occurs to us that maybe if we scream loud enough that we can wake up the driver somehow. So in desperation, we start shouting at the top of our lungs as high as we can, "Wake up, wake up, wake up, God! Grab the steering wheel, you have to do something." In Isaiah 51, the people of Israel are screaming at God at the top of their lungs. "Wake up! Wake up! Awake! Awake!" they yell in verse 9. "Gird up your arms and do something strong. Wake up, Lord, and act like you did in the past for previous generations." The second half of the book of Isaiah was written to a people living in exile in Babylon, suffering as captives under the brutal imperial regime of King Nebuchadnezzar. During the exile, the Hebrew people felt that they had been abandoned by God, that God had gone on vacation and disappeared or fallen asleep at the wheel as Israel was defeated, their temple destroyed, and the people taken away into slavery. They'd been in exile now a long time and were experiencing a sense of spiritual weariness and emotional exhaustion. And so the prophet Isaiah gave voice to a people in utter desperation, grieving the absence of their God and shouting for God to wake up and save them, to arise from slumber, and to come and deliver them from exile. Their oppressor, King Nebuchadnezzar, he was a bad dude, a really bad dude. Jeremiah called him the destroyer of nations. To build his empire, Nebuchadnezzar literally decimated hundreds of communities. His capital was 60 miles south of what is modern-day Baghdad, along the Euphrates River, and its reach was so vast, it's still the largest archaeological site in the entire Middle East. Yet along with his penchant for domination, Nebuchadnezzar suffered debilitating nightmares, which some called dreams, and humiliating periods of irrationality and madness. But his real name was not Nebuchadnezzar at all, but Nebuchadrezzar, with an R, named after the Mesopotamian god of wisdom, Nabu. And his name literally means, Nabu, or God, preserve my firstborn. Nabu, preserve my firstborn. But throughout the Bible, he is called Nebuchadnezzar with an N, because the Hebrew writers often replaced the R with an N when they transcribed his name. And they did this in order to change it slightly, to change the meaning of his name slightly from God preserve my firstborn to God preserve my donkey. Or most likely, God preserve my jackass. It's amazing what one letter can do to a name. It was a subtle, ingenious, and hilarious form of resistance. Calling King Nebuchadnezzar Nebuchadnezzar is the equivalent of replacing the phrase, "Long live the queen" or king, with "Long live the jackass." The people were playfully undermining imperial propaganda and casting dispersions at their violent overlord without getting themselves into trouble. Some of you might want to find your own creative option to try out this election season. This beautiful form of resistance is so beautiful the people could say it among themselves to poke fun at their oppressor, but if the Babylonian authorities heard them and tried to arrest them, they could say in response, "I'm so sorry, my Akkadian is a little rusty. I'm working on the pronunciation, but I'm still trying to distinguish my R's from my N's. I meant Nebuchadnezzar, of course." The necessity, though, of this subtle resistance is an illustration of how brutal and oppressive the reign of God preserve my jackass truly was. It was monstrously, monstrously cruel. An embodiment of the horrific suffering of the people of Israel can be seen in the crushing song of sadness and lament that we read in Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon, it says, "We sat down and we wept as we remembered our homeland. On the willows of the trees there we hung up our harps. For our captors asked for us songs, and our tormentors asked for us mirth, singing, 'Sing us one of the songs of Zion.'" But how could we sing the song of Zion in a foreign land? It's one of the oldest blues songs ever written. And it ends with a prayer that God will pay back their great destroyer, Nebuchadnezzar, and Babylon for what they did to Israel by taking their children and dashing their bodies against the rocks. The Hebrew people may have had enough humor to razz their king and call him a donkey, but they were incredibly angry, and rightly so. As captives and oppressed people, they were filled with a righteous anger, the kind of holy indignation that rages against grief and loss and injustice, the kind of sacred fury that refuses to accept the reality of injustice, humiliation, and degradation, the degradation of slavery and subjugation. Recently, Yale University conducted an interview with scholar Willie Jennings, and he offered a surprising revelation about the relationship between anger and hope. Willie said, "I'm not a person who has given over to hopelessness. I remember my parents constantly telling me, 'Hope in God and live in that hope.' But at this point in my life, the most important question for me right now is, how might my hope be shared? Not through the sharing of prayers or thoughts, but the sharing of my anger, which I hope is always bound to the righteousness of God." Hope, he says, is a discipline. It's not a sentiment. It's a virtue we must work to cultivate in ourselves. He says, "What I have learned is that living the discipline of hope in this racial world, in this white supremacist-infested country called the United States of America, requires anger." "I am angry," he said, "but my anger is shareable. In fact, it must be shared." Willie went on to say, "I don't think enough people, especially Christians, understand that the righteous indignation of God is to be shared. I've had many dear friends call me," he said, well-meaning all of them. They call me and text me and email me after George Floyd's murder with their condolences, each in their own way saying to me, "I can't imagine how you're feeling right now." "Yes, you can," he says. "Yes, you can. My anger is shareable. Indeed, one of the most stubborn barriers to overcoming this racial world is the refusal of so many people to take hold of black anger, to feel black anger. It is a particular sickness of whiteness that invites people to imagine themselves as spectators of racial suffering and observers of black pain who are allowed to feel only assorted forms of white guilt or shame. We all know anger is frightening because it's not very easy to control. Anger can easily get out of control and touch hatred. And if anger enters into hatred, then we'll be drawn into violence. And way too many people in this world have already been drawn deeply into violence. But what the Christian faith knows, he says, is that the way to keep anger from hatred is not to deny anger, to pretend that it's not real. No, we can't do that. That's not the truth at all, and that won't work. The Bible says, be angry but do not sin, which distinguishes anger from sin. But how do we toe that line between anger and hatred? Willie claims that what keeps anger from touching hatred is not the cunning of human reason or the power of human will. It is simply Jesus. For the Christian, it is the life and teaching of Jesus that stands between anger and hatred, prohibiting that breach, blocking the touch, saying, don't go there. There's nothing there but death. Anger bound to God's righteous indignation has a different purpose in the world. It points us to change that must happen, that is overturning of this unjust world order, the racial order. So we take a hold of anger. We must take a hold of anger, step into it, feel it, and into God's own righteous indignation, knowing that God will invite us to turn away from hatred even as we enter into anger. If we wish to be disciplined by hope right now, he says, we need anger. Anger is the engine that drives hope, because anger turns us toward the urgency of the moment, as Dr. King said so eloquently, and the deep desire to change the world. The constructive anger the Israelites expressed about an absent God who they believed was asleep at the wheel led directly to hope and salvation. They yelled, "Wake up, God, and deliver us from our oppressors as you did before. Aren't you the one who cut Egypt into pieces and pierced that last imperial dragon who held us captive there? Aren't you the one who dried up the sea so that we could cross over into the promised land? Well, do it again, God. Deliver us again, liberate us again, save us again, and we will then sing the songs of Zion again with everlasting joy and gladness." It was their expression of a brutally truthful, unadulterated, and pregnant anger that gave birth to a new hope. Sometimes anger is the only thing powerful enough to cut through the fog of our despair. Anger is a catalyst for change. Anger almost always leads to action, which means that anger is the best stimulus for a new way of life. Anger can be that spark that ignites hope and generates a process that leads to salvation and deliverance. As Audre Lorde once said, rage, when it is focused with precision, can become a powerful source of energy serving progress and change. I must offer a trigger warning before this next story to those who have been the victims of abuse. There's a writer named Sarah Moon who describes how growing up, she was taught to be a good Christian girl, and that good Christian girls never get angry. The patriarchal theology she was immersed in as a child told her that she should never, ever be angry, especially not with a man. And then she met a guy who abused her. And that good Christian girl inside her stuffed all that anger down. This is why good theology is so important in the church. Eventually, of course, Sarah found herself in a life-threatening relationship and did not know how to get herself out. The pattern of abuse continued for years until one day her abuser slammed her face into the dashboard of her car, which got blood all over her shirt. That was the thing that ignited a fire of anger in her that finally gave her the power she needed to stand up for herself and make a change once and for all. Sarah says, I felt anger pulsing through my veins, my hands shaking with the rush of energy. I was angry beyond all ability to fear this man who I knew could hurt me and had hurt me, beyond all the ability to feel guilt, beyond all the reasoning myself into staying, beyond all the toxic feelings of love and affection. Anger pushed me beyond all the hundreds of feelings and excuses and fears that were keeping me trapped in a cycle of abuse. I know that anger can be empowering and energizing and subversive, and that's why I won't stop being angry until there's nothing left for me to be angry about. Sarah says, I'm defensive about anger because I know that anger saved my life. Salvation was born from the Israelites' anger at their oppressors, their anger at their God being asleep while they were locked in the trunk. Liberation came from the ashes of their anger with the good news of comfort, the promise of divine consolation. The God who they aroused from slumber by their anger and their shouts was a God of comfort, a God who identified as comfort, named as comfort. The author of John says that God is love, but the prophet Isaiah proclaims that God is comfort. God said, I am the one who comforts. As 21st century people, though, we associate the word comfort with the idea of soothing someone or soothing something. We comfort our infants when they cry at night. To comfort for us means to calm or to soothe or to pacify and settle something down. But that is not what the prophet Isaiah meant by the comfort of God. The word for comfort here is nahamu, and it is certainly related to the idea of consolation, but more like a consolation prize than a weighted blanket, warm milk, soft words, or a pat on the back. According to Isaiah, the comfort that is synonymous with God, that is identified with God, is not the act of making someone feel better about the pain and discomfort that they are experiencing in their life, but the creative power of giving someone hope. The consolation prize of God is always the gift of new life. Every image Isaiah used to paint a picture of God's comfort was an image teeming with new life and vitality. Isaiah connects God's comfort with the animating visions of new life springing forth like a rock, like water from a rock, or a geyser bursting up from a quarry, or the birth of a newborn child given to Abraham and Sarah, or the rain and lush greenery filling the wilderness and deserted places of Jerusalem, transforming them into the Garden of Eden. The comfort of God is actually a mighty inversion from stone to spring, from barrenness to birth, from wilderness to garden, from death to life, from old to new, from devastation to new creation. Every image of comfort Isaiah offered was of new life and new creation. That's why those famous words of consolation we sing every Advent in Isaiah 40, comfort, comfort ye my people, should be translated new life, new future for my people. The good news of comfort is that all the places in our lives that are bereft of life will be renewed and restored and re-energized and rejuvenated. The good news of the people of Israel is that their world of exile that they thought was dead was not lifeless at all, but was alive with an energizing anger and the hope of newness, a newness which will not be disappointed. The good news of comfort is that life always finds a way. Even in the most deserted times, in the most desolate places, in the harshest circumstances, God's answer to the Israelites' pain was not to soothe them or calm them, but to offer them the animating truth that new creation was coming, that a new future was on the horizon. To be a comforter is truly to be a creator. A new creator who brings new vision out of the crushed dreams and new life from wasted places. In the midst of this pandemic, we are all longing for God to wake up and do something. To wake up and take the wheel and pop the trunk and let us out and give us some comfort, God, to make a way beyond the dragon of COVID-19, beyond the Babylon of our lives right now, and beyond all the babbling jackasses of our world. We are all in need of God's creative comfort. But too often we simply want to feel good. We want to be soothed from our pain. But while we want to be soothed and while we want to feel good, God wants to give us a brand new future and make all things new. God doesn't comfort us by returning what we lost, giving us back the life we had before, or bringing things back to normal again. God always, always, always comforts us with the gift of something new. New life, new creation, new future. So we have to ask ourselves right now, what is the new life that God is trying to comfort us with right now? What is the new creation that God is giving birth to for the sake of our consolation? What is the new future God is springing to life for the sake of our world? And will we be comforted by it? The consolation prize that God offers those who suffer is always the hope of something new. But like any prize, we have to be willing to receive it. New things are scary. We don't often consider them comforting. But God does. God does, and that's because God knows us. And God knows that we will only be ready to receive the good news of hope and the gift of new creation when we are angry enough to make a change. Amen.